All I have for you is a word. Tenet. It'll open the right doors, some of the wrong ones, too. Use it carefully.
Hey everyone! Christopher Nolan's new action epic Tenet is definitely one of the most complicated films ever made. And having seen it twice now, I'm gonna try and explain some of the concepts in the film, the overall plot, as well as the timeline for some of the major characters. I want to start with the simpler stuff and explain a few of the concepts of the film, and then slowly work my way to the more complicated stuff. So basically, Tenet deals with the concept of inversion. It enables characters in the film to reverse an object's entropy, which basically allows it to flow backwards in time, and this concept is foundation for time travel in the film. The main difference between the Tenet version of time travel and the time travel that we see in films like Avengers Endgame or the Terminator franchise is that the characters in those films travel back in time in a sort of instantaneous way and basically appear at a point in time. But in Tenet, time travel into the past is always proportional to the time traveled into the future. This means that if you wanted to travel back 5 days in the Tenet method, it would mean that you would have to spend 5 days traveling back in time to arrive on Monday. It wouldn't be instantaneous. And this is basically how inversion works in Tenet. Now, what actually happens in the film? So I'm gonna go through the plot here, and if you don't want any spoilers, I suggest you just turn off the video right now, because this is going to be full of spoilers from the very beginning. I'm going to explain the plot in a way that you sort of understand it after you watch the film. So at the beginning of the film, at the opera scene, we see the protagonist. I'm actually not going to call him that because it's ridiculous. I'm just going to call him John, as he's played by John David Washington. So at the beginning of the film, John is a part of a CIA mission to prevent plutonium, or what they think is plutonium, but in fact is one of the 9 parts of the algorithm, which is basically a doomsday machine. Anyhow, during this mission, John is saved by an inverted version of Neil, who is traveling back from the future. Afterwards, John is captured and tortured as a part of a test, which he passes, and is then armed with the word Tenet and sent on a mission to save the world. He travels to a research facility where he's briefed about inversion and the looming threat of a third world war, and he's shown inverted bullets from the future, which he decides to track down, and so he travels to Mumbai in order to find the arms dealer who manufactured them. In Mumbai, he meets Neil. This is the same version of Neil that saved his life at the opera, or at least I believe it is. He basically traveled back from the future, he saved John's life, and then he went through the time machine, went into the normal flow of time, and he meets John in Mumbai. Together they infiltrate the house of an Indian arms dealer who turns out to actually be a pawn, and the real boss is his wife called Priya, and she turns out to actually be a part of Tenet. And she tells John that the real villain he's looking for is a Russian oligarch called Andrei Sator, who is receiving help from the future. She sends John to London, where he will get help and guidance in order to get close to Sator. So he meets up with Michael Caine, who tells him to basically buy a better suit if he wants to get close to Sator by seducing his wife Kat. Now, once he meets Kat, he discovers that Sator has her in sort of a blackmailing chokehold. It's all a bit complicated, but the important thing here is that the painting is what gives Sator hold over his wife, and so John offers to help her by stealing the painting from a free port at an Oslo airport. John enlists Neil to help him, and together they forge a plan which consists of crashing a 747 into a building, which is one of the most epic scenes of the film. And during this operation, John is attacked by a masked, inverted version of himself, traveling back from the future, while Neil chases after the version of John that's already in real time. And this means that at this specific moment, there's actually 2 versions of John in the same timeline. After the events at Oslo, John consults Priya about his next steps, and she suggests that he should steal plutonium for Sator as it is the only thing that he is after since the events of the opera. So John finally gets to meet Sator, and he strikes a bargain with him to steal the plutonium for him in exchange for letting his wife Kat go. John and Neil travel to Estonia, where the algorithm is being transported on a highway, and they pull off this amazing heist by stealing it from a moving car, but shortly afterwards they are actually intercepted by an inverted version of Sator and his crew, who manage to capture John and Kat as well, while Neil calls in for the cavalry, which is basically Ives and his time-traveling army. John is interrogated about the location of the algorithm by Sator, and Neil and Ives arrive just in time to save John, but not in time to save or to prevent Sator from shooting Kat with an inverted bullet. John goes back in time to try and stop Sator from getting the algorithm, but is unsuccessful, and John, Neil and Kat decide to travel back in time inside of an inverted container, as this is the only way for her to survive. They basically want to get back in time to the events of the airport in Oslo, where they will take her through the time machine that they encountered there. And so they arrive at the airport, and John fights the past version of himself while he makes his way into the time machine. Once he gets out, he gets chased by Neil, who then lets him go, and the other Neil takes Kat through the time machine, which somehow heals her. This isn't really explained in the film though, but she's healed, she only has a scar. Now at this point, John seeks out Priya again and tries to convince her not to send him after the algorithm, as it will inevitably fall into Sator's hands. And Priya explains that it was always meant to happen this way, and that instead he should travel into the past where Sator has already traveled, and he intends to end the world by putting together the algorithm and setting off the doomsday device basically. When John asks about how Priya and her people also have time-traveling devices, she answers that they are receiving help from the future, as Tenet was founded in the future and not in the past. And so John forges a plan, as he suspects that Sator will try to end his life during the Vietnam holiday, as this was the last time Kat made him feel loved, and it also coincides with the date of the explosion in Sator's birthplace. I think it was his birthplace in Russia, this was casually mentioned by the Michael Caine character during lunch, that 2 weeks ago there was an explosion in Russia. So John, Neil and Kat and Ives' army all travel weeks back in time on the boat. Now this is where the film really starts to get confusing. So basically what they want to do is called the Temporal Pincer move, which means that the army splits in two teams, a blue team and a red team. Both teams are inverted at this point because they're traveling back in time on the boat. So while they're on the boat, everyone is inverted and everyone is traveling back in time. Now the blue team, along with Neil, pass through the time traveling machine and exit the boat before the rest of the team does. So Neil and the blue team get out, and this way they enter the timeline after the explosion in Russia takes place. This enables them to get to the location and invert themselves once more to travel back through time and into the battle and relay information to the red team. Now the red team, they stay on the boat a bit longer, so they travel a bit further back in time to a time before the explosion takes place, and they pass through the time machine, and Kat goes to Vietnam to prevent the future version of Sator, the one from the highway, from killing himself and automatically triggering the algorithm to set off the doomsday device. Ives and John, who are on the red team, their objective is to go through the battle in normal time and then get on to the doomsday device and manage to defuse it before Sator kills himself or before Kat kills him. And during the battle, Neil notices Ives and John entering a tunnel that leads to the device, and shortly after this he notices Volkov is planting a booby trap there, and this is very confusing because Neil is inverted, so everybody that is in real time, he perceives them as going backwards. So although we see Volkov planting the trap after John and Ives entered the tunnel, he actually set it before they entered it, and so in order to save them, Neil seeks out the enemy's time machine device and passes through it. By doing this, he reinverts himself to the same flow of time that John John and Ives are in, and he's basically traveled into the past a few moments before they ran into the tunnel. So he quickly drives after them, and he sees them as they are about to enter the tunnel, so he starts honking in order to stop them from running in, but this is unsuccessful. So he comes up with a slightly different plan where he will throw them a rope down into the tomb, or whatever you want to call it, a tomb or a cave or facility, and he'll try to pull them out once they defuse the device. Now, in real time, John and Ives pass through the tunnel and enter the tomb, where the device is behind a locked door, and they see a corpse on the floor with an orange ribbon, which John also saw at the opera, and we later learned that this was Neil all along. Now, Volkov appears behind the door, and he puts Sator on speaker, who is in Vietnam with Kat, so he can deliver his, this final bad guy speech about how he's gonna kill everybody and nobody can do anything about it. In this speech, we learn that global warming caused by us is the reason why people from the future are helping him. I guess they want to end the past to avoid global warming. And once he finishes his speech, he orders Volkov to shoot John in the head. But just as he's about to do it, the corpse on the floor springs back to life, takes the bullet, unlocks the door, and runs out of the tomb inverted. John and Ives overpower Volkov and stop him from detonating the device, while present-time Neil throws them a rope and pulls them out of the tomb while they grab the algorithm and the explosion goes off. Once they are safe, John realizes that it was Neil all along who saved him in the opera and who took the bullet for him. And Neil explains that he's been recruited by John in the future. After Neil explains that this was basically the ending of a beautiful friendship for him, he goes off to invert himself one last time to unlock the door and take the bullet for John and die. Now, while this was all taking place, Kat was on the boat and she killed Sator, and she decides to jump off the boat, and her past self catches a glimpse of her, and this is the time where basically we see two versions of Kat existing in the same timeline, but the Kat that we see at the end of the film, it's the one that jumped off the boat, the scarred one, as once she goes beyond the point in which she went back in time for the first time, which was after the highway scene, there will only be one Kat. The same principle applies to John as well. The John we see at the end of the film is a version of John that exists alongside the John we see throughout the film, but once he passes through the time machine after the highway sequence, the John from the end of the film will be the only one left in the timeline, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I think that's it. So for me, the hardest part to wrap my head around was definitely Neil and his entire storyline and his timeline, because I couldn't figure out which one was at the opera and which one was the one that died at the end. If it was the one that we saw being briefed along with the rest of the blue team, or if it was the one that we saw at the end having the conversation with John. But I think it's pretty clear in the film and from the dialogue that the Neil that's having the conversation is the same Neil that will go on to die right afterwards. There's a few theories floating around that he might actually be Max, Kat's son. I highly doubt this, because Neil is around 30 years old in the film, which means that he would have to start traveling back in time at a very young age, and he wouldn't have enough time to build a beautiful friendship with John, unless you don't age while you're traveling back in time, while you're being inverted basically. But I highly doubt that, because that wouldn't make much sense. Your time flow is just reverted, which could actually mean that you're getting younger when you're traveling back in time, but then that wouldn't make sense, because the documents that Sato receives from the future, he receives this, some time capsule filled with gold bricks and instructions. Those papers, they couldn't have ink on them if you would actually age in reverse, because by the time they arrived in the past, the ink would be gone, or at least that's my logic. So I think you age normally when you're inverted. Anyway, if you have any more questions, please ask them in the comments and I'll answer them. And thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
What'll happen here?
Hasn't happened yet.